In Ingrid's keynote, we're going to learn about how attention and sound quality affect how well we understand and remember speech. So please help me welcome Ingrid to the stage.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's truly a privilege to be here to talk to you today. As Lisa said, I trained as a neuropsychologist, a clinical psychologist, and neuropsychology was subsequently rebranded as cognitive neuroscience. And the central aim of cognitive neuroscience is to map all our thinking, so language, attention, feelings, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, to map all of those things onto the distributed activity of brain networks, so the coordinated activity of different parts of the brain working together. And for 20 years, I've been fascinated by the problem of how we take sound, this complex, time-varying, highly variable from one individual to another signal, and seemingly, in many cases, effortlessly map it onto linguistic representations. It's amazing. It's magic that we do this. And when the signal is degraded, we still manage better than any automatic speech recognition system can. Now, speech recognition systems are improving exponentially, but I think it's still fair to say that in highly degraded conditions, we can still outperform them. And how do we do that? Well, when the signal is degraded and no longer capable of supporting perception on its own, we have to use our knowledge and our experience to repair and complete the signal to perceive it as speech. One of the reasons I'm interested in the importance of knowledge in speech perception is a glass half full view of the aging process. So one thing that older people have going for them is a wealth of knowledge and experience. And I'm interested in how older people can use their knowledge and their experience to mitigate the effects of hearing loss. What ways can knowledge be used to help? I'm also going to be talking about the role of attention in the perception of degraded speech. And I'm also going to be, throughout the talk, coming back to this idea of listening effort that Francis talked about yesterday. So in this talk, I'm going to hit I've got five little stories prepared for you. Some of them are a little longer than others. The first is I'm going to give you some examples of how knowledge can assist or moderate speech perception. The second is to address the question, well, okay, given that in everyday life we often hear speech when we're not fully attending to it. We're doing the dishes, we're driving a car, and if that speech is degraded, is our brain able to process it the same way that it processes it if we're fully attending? This is a difficult question to ask behaviorally, because as soon as you have somebody focused on another task, their behavior is all about that other task, right? The advantage of brain imaging is that we have a window into the brain so we can compare the processing of speech when people are attending to it fully compared to how that speech is processed when people are doing something else. And we've used that tool to look at what I would call effortless processing. So yesterday in his talk, Francis was talking about the goal of having effortless speech processing. And I think we can't be confident that processing is truly effortless unless our efforts are dedicated somewhere else. If we're processing it in the absence of any kind of attention, then that's pretty effortless. So we use that as a baseline. Then I'm going to briefly talk about how listening effort may not be very special. That listening effort, at least as far as brain imaging tells us, is really a reflection of more general cognitive effort. There's a network in the brain that is active whenever you're working hard mentally at something. And that general activity in that network can serve as a marker of listening effort. But listening effort doesn't seem to be particularly special compared to the effort required to remember a series of digits or the effort required to respond quickly to a visual cue. Then, I'd like to break listening effort down a little bit. Listening effort is a manifestation of challenges that are posed by a communicative situation and then are met by your brain. And so I'm going to be talking about that a little bit, and then follow up by more explicitly talking about maybe what causes listening effort and how if we want to study listening effort, we need to understand why it happens. Okay, so knowledge. What kind of knowledge can help when you're trying to understand someone? Imagine you're in a conversation with somebody, and this is you, right? You're trying to convey a message. And here's the person you're talking to. They're trying to perceive that message. Now, unfortunately, telepathy hasn't developed very much in humans, and so we have to talk, right? And this listener needs to use what they know to understand what you are saying to them. And they have a lot of information at their disposal that can help with that. So they may know the topic of the conversation. So in this talk that I'm giving, you're going to hear the words brain and processing and speech and language a lot, because that's the topic. World knowledge helps. So if I say, it was a sunny day and the children were going to the... If I finish that sentence with chiropractor, you'll be surprised, right? You're probably expecting me to say beach or park, because you know what children do on sunny days as a rule. Knowledge of words and their meanings. As I'll go on to talk about, many words in languages have multiple meanings. So for example, if you open any English dictionary at random, approximately 80% of the words will have more than one meaning listed. How does our brain know which meaning is appropriate in a given circumstance? It feels quite effortless when you hear a sentence like, the shell was fired towards the tank. You know what meaning shell, fired, and tank should have, but it isn't entirely obvious going into it that you would be able to effortlessly figure out those meanings, right? Shell could just as easily have been the kind that you find on a beach. And of course, we have rules that govern how we put words together, and our deep knowledge of those rules helps us to understand. Speech passes out over an articulatory filter. We can learn about a particular talker's voice characteristics, and that can be extremely helpful. We can work out what sex they are, what size they are, we know that, and that can help us identify their voice. Those characteristics are associated with particular acoustic characteristics that we can search for in the auditory environment. If we're familiar with the accent that somebody is speaking with, that can also help us. When I was a teenager, I moved to an outport in Newfoundland, which, for those of you who don't know, is an island in the Atlantic, somewhat like Iceland and Greenland. It's north, it's rather isolated, it has a rich linguistic culture, and if you're not from there, it can be very hard to understand what people are saying. And visible speech. So when somebody is talking to you, you can use your knowledge of how the facial gestures map onto speech sounds to help you understand what they're saying. That sound passes out into the environment, and there are also sources of knowledge in that process that you can use. So for example, we know about echoes, for example. We know how sound reverberates in closed environments, and we can discount echoes. We seem to be able to develop templates for the acoustic characteristics of particular spaces so that we can compensate for the peculiar acoustics of those spaces. if you know, it turns out, if you are familiar with the person who is annoyingly talking over somebody that you're listening to, we've shown that knowledge of that voice can help you to ignore or suppress it. If you can see objects in the environment that are obviously creating sound, you can also use that knowledge to help segregate and suppress those annoying masking sounds. A hearing aid has to preserve the acoustics that are critical for the use of these different kinds of knowledge. Or it would be nice if it did, right? Okay, how might knowledge help? Well, one way knowledge can help is to improve the perceptual segregation of sounds, right? To perceptually pull them apart so you can attend to one or another more easily. It may improve the effective SNR, perceptually enhancing the target signal and suppressing the masker, or either of those. Oh, I've done it again. It might fill in missing information. So if you have a sentence, the eel was on the table, you don't know what that first sound was, you can use the context. Your brain effortlessly uses the context to work out that it was meal that you heard. So that kind of phoneme completion is done pretty routinely by the brain. Right, so you effectively fill in this missing bit of signal. And all of these factors, by making that target sound easier to perceive, may reduce listening effort. Okay, so the work that I've done spans many of these possible sources of information, how people use this information. I'm going to be talking about 4 of these today. And we'll start with familiar voice information. So when you're familiar with somebody, you know their voice, that helps you in 2 ways. First, it helps you to identify that person, right? But it also turns out that that voice is more intelligible in noise. So if you're going to a busy restaurant and you want to have a good conversation with somebody, go with somebody you know. You'll have an easier time. A few years ago, colleagues and I performed a study where we took people who'd been married for 27 years or more. These were couples who had been together for essentially forever. So that their spouse voice was the last voice they heard every night, the first voice they heard every morning. We were looking for voices that were just ridiculously familiar. And we were interested in how well people could, or the benefit that older people, kind of by definition, if you're married 27 years, you're not in your early 20s, the benefit that people could get from having their spouse voices as a target in a mixture of 2 voices. And for this, we used the coordinate response measure procedure. This is a rather peculiar corpus or set of materials. We had our spouses record these materials themselves, of course, but all the sentences are of the form, ready, call sign, go to color number now. Not the sort of thing you usually say to your spouse, ready, Baron, go to green 2 now. But the test is nice because we can avoid bias psychometrically. There's a single response, namely the color number coordinate that the Baron voice is told to go to on every trial. So on every trial, people hear a mixture of 2 talkers, and they simply report the color number coordinate that Baron was told to go to. So here's an example. I've given you the answers here, so it should be easy to hear.
Ready, Charlie, go to red 2 now.
Okay, so that's what they heard. And what we found was that over a range of target to masker ratios, there was a really robust benefit for having your spouse as the target voice. People just did better when their spouse was the target, the Baron voice. We've subsequently replicated this using a matrix test, also a closed set kind of speech intelligibility test. Again, it's nice psychometrically, although it doesn't really reflect the open set nature of natural speech. But anyway, every test has its drawbacks. So here, all of the sentences are of the form, say, Bob lost 2 red gloves, or Pat sold 6 small shoes. And the participant was told to listen out for either the Bob or the Pat voice, and then pick the other 4 words from this matrix that the Bob or the Pat voice said. And we did this with friends and with spouses who hadn't been married quite as long as the spouses in the first study. And we found almost exactly the same thing. So this seems to be a very robust finding, at least for the closed set tests we've used here. We're currently developing some more naturalistic speech listening experiments, just to make sure that this is not an artifact of our rather artificial kinds of tests. But I'd like you to appreciate the magnitude of this benefit. Okay, so it's pretty stable across these different listening conditions, across target to masker ratios. And if you look at performance at minus 6 dB here in this familiar target condition, and we track it over to where performance is the same in the both unfamiliar condition. So this is a condition where there are 2 novel talkers, there's no familiar voice information here, and you can see that the performance is around, you need to have listening conditions of about plus 3 dB for performance to be similar in that both unfamiliar condition. So this is really quite a big difference. Okay, so the next question is, well, what are the acoustic cues that people are using to get this benefit? And at the same time, we can ask, well, what are the acoustic cues that people use to identify their friends and their spouses? So my postdoc, Emma Holmes, has recently completed a study where she's looked at she's manipulated the fundamental frequency of voices, and also the vocal tract length acoustically, or the acoustic correlates of vocal tract length, in order to see whether this familiarity benefit is robust against these manipulations. So just a reminder, back to audiology school, the way that the voice is produced is through rhythmic openings and closings of the vocal cord, right? And that rate of opening and closing it determines the fundamental frequency. That's the source. And then as you alter the shape of your vocal tract, the resonances change, right? And so the resonances here depend on the shape of the vocal tract, and the resonance peaks are the formants in speech. And as the vocal tract gets longer, those resonances shift down in frequency. So here are some examples of voices, quite idiosyncratic voices, recognizable voices. Here's some Barry White, because no talk should be without Barry White.
I've heard people say that too much of anything is not good for you, baby.
Right. So he has both a low fundamental and he's a big man, right? So long vocal tract. This is Julia Child, American chef. She was a very tall woman, over 6 feet tall. She also had a very long vocal tract, but she had a glottal pulse rate, or a voice source that was more characteristic of other shorter women. And so her voice was quite distinctive. And here she is talking about chickens.
Presents the Chicken Sisters. Miss Broiler, Miss Fryer, Miss Roaster, Miss Caponette, Miss Stewer, and old Madam Hen.
So quite a distinctive voice, right? And that the distinctiveness is produced by that combination of a high fundamental and this long vocal tract, so low resonances. So what Emma did was to manipulate both of the vocal tract length and the fundamental. And she manipulated this a lot. For those of you who would like me to quantify a lot, I can say that we found the 90%, or Emma found the 90% discrimination threshold, both for fundamental frequency and for the vocal tract length parameter. And then she took 5 times that threshold value and effectively added it. So she increased either the fundamental or the vocal tract length by 5 J and Ds effectively. So here's an original sentence.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
And I can point out here that when you have people read these sentences, these are just people off the street, right? They're not professional voice actors or anything. And so we're really messing with their prosody when we have them say 128 sentences or 256 sentences of Pat lost 2 green fish, Bob bought 5 green shoes. So the prosodic information in these sentences is really not naturalistic at all, which is an advantage for us, right? Because we just want to isolate the more local acoustic characteristics that give rise to a benefit. Okay, so here we have shifted the fundamental.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
And here we have shifted the vocal tract length.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
And here we've shifted both.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
Okay, so for all of these different kinds of sentences, we had our listeners simply say whether the sentence could have been spoken by their familiar partner who'd been recorded, right? So we have that data. And we also ran the speech intelligibility study where everybody heard in the experiment their familiar voice and then 2 novel voices that were age and sex matched to their familiar voice, right? So that we could have that familiar target with a novel masker condition, and we could also have a both unfamiliar condition where both of the sentences were spoken by unfamiliar talkers. So that's those conditions. Okay. Oops. So we did try some smaller changes before we went for the 5 times the just noticeable difference change, and we didn't find any effect. So we whacked up that manipulation, and this is what we observed. So here is the ability of people to say that a sentence spoken by their partner, their spouse, or their friend was actually their spouse or friend, and they're pretty good, right, for the original unmanipulated materials. As soon as we manipulate the vocal tract length and the F0, identification recognition drops down to chance, and stays at chance if we leave F0 unmanipulated, if we just change the vocal tract length. So this is pointing to vocal tract length as being quite important. And indeed, if we only manipulate the fundamental, then performance is as it was with the original sentence. So this really indicates to us that for explicit recognition, being able to tell your spouse or partner from a stranger that the vocal tract length information, whatever the acoustic correlates of that are, that's quite important. So the spectral profile tells you something about the identity of the talker. So how about for the intelligibility? Well, first, here's for our original sentences. So this just replicates the benefit that people get from having their familiar partner as the target. We get better performance for a familiar target condition than we do in that both unfamiliar condition where both talkers are strangers. And reassuringly, for all of our manipulated conditions where the unfamiliar voice has been manipulated, either shifting the vocal tract length or the fundamental or both, performance doesn't seem to have suffered much, right? Whenever you don't know somebody, even if you've manipulated the voice, performance is about the same. So now, for each of these manipulated conditions, we can look at the intelligibility benefit. How much benefit are people getting from the manipulated vocal tract length or from the manipulated fundamental frequency? Okay, so that's our regular familiar target benefit. So now we're going to show that as a bar graph. And here you go. So this is our original effect And here we are with the F naught only. And then whenever we manipulate the vocal tract length, performance is reduced. Okay, so again, just as with the explicit recognition, people seem to be using the vocal tract length information to be helping them to understand this voice better in a mixture of two talkers. Okay. So, in conclusion, for this section, familiar voices are helpful. They're helpful both in terms of, letting you know who you're talking to, but also if you're in a situation where there's a masking talker, then you can use what you know about that person's voice to hear them better. So that's good. Benefit in real life is probably a lot greater because we have, like I said, spoiled almost all the other interesting information that you could get from a talker, right? We've got nothing about that person's habitual habits of speech, which you can learn about. We've got nothing about the topics that that person is likely to talk about. We've messed with their typical naturalistic prosody, as I said. All we have here are the local acoustic cues for their voice, pretty much. So we think that vocal tract length information is quite important for being able to use familiar talker. And we find effects of these big manipulations, but not of little ones. So there is probably other acoustic cues that we haven't yet identified that are quite important for knowing who you're talking to. And so both knowing who you're talking to and benefiting from that voice seem to rely on the same information. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to another kind of knowledge. And this is knowledge of what's going to be said, our ability to predict what we're about to hear. And yesterday, Nina Kraus gave a compelling demonstration of how knowledge can influence your perception of degraded speech. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to change the demonstration in a couple of key ways. First of all, instead of using speech and noise, I'm going to use a simulation called noise-vocoded speech, where we simply take the speech signal, we divide it into logarithmically spaced frequency bands, we extract the amplitude envelope from each band, and we use that. We apply that to band-limited noise, so noise in the same frequency band. And then we add them all up again together. And the more bands you have, the more intelligible the speech is. So here is a sentence that's been noise-vocoded.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
Anybody? What did you hear? I'll play it again. See what you get.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
Okay. Here's the sentence. Yeah, I heard some words there. So here's the sentence. Okay. And I'll play it again. I could play this one, but to show you that there's no tricks, I'll play it over here again.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
So once you know what the sentence is, you perceive it as much more clear. This is quite an interesting effect, and over the last decade or more, my colleague Matt Davis, Alexei Hervé-Edelman and I have, and others have looked at how well people can learn to understand this kind of a manipulation, and how this feedback seems to help. So people learn this distortion better, faster, more efficiently, if they get that opportunity to map what they know or onto the degraded speech, compared to if they just hear new exemplars of degraded speech over and over again. Okay, so we call this illusory perceptual clarity pop-out. Okay, and it's illusory because the stimulus didn't change. It was only your perception that changed. Okay, so I don't need to talk about noise vocoding, except I will just say that we do find this very useful because most people are naive to this manipulation. It was initially developed as a crude-ish simulation of speech as heard through a cochlear implant. But we like it because most people don't know what it sounds like, and so we can study perceptual learning quite easily. By manipulating the number of bands, You can change the intelligibility parametrically, that's handy. By mixing and matching the amplitude envelopes with different noise bands, we can render a stimulus completely unintelligible. So acoustically, it's quite similar. We still have amplitude envelopes applied to noise bands, but if we apply the amplitude envelopes to the wrong noise bands, then the speech doesn't make any sense. So it's useful to have that kind of acoustically very well matched, but entirely unintelligible signal. And finally, there's no segregation demand imposed here. When you hear speech in babble or speech in noise, you try to perceptually separate the target from the masker. And here, the target and the masker are one. There's no way, there's no affordance for perceptual segregation here. Okay, so we have demonstrated that this illusory perceptual clarity seems to have a correlate as far back as the first auditory cortical receiving area for sound, primary auditory cortex. This is an image of primary auditory cortex as defined based on the cellular architecture of cortex. So it's this very specific region here on Heschel's gyrus. And in an fMRI study, we had people listen to perfectly clear sentences, to noise vocoded sentences that were hard to understand, and then to these rotated, unintelligible noise vocoded sentences where we've mixed and matched the amplitude envelopes and the noise bands. And in each case, the sentence was either preceded by matching text, as with the camel was kept in a cage at the zoo, or with non-matching nonsense text that couldn't help you understand it. And what we found in auditory cortex was auditory cortex really liked clear speech. Clear speech is acoustically quite complex and well-structured, and auditory cortex seems to appreciate that. It didn't respond as much to this rotated unintelligible condition. And in both of these cases, there was no difference whether there was matching text or non-matching text. But for this potentially intelligible noise vocoded speech, when we had matching text, the activity levels in auditory cortex were more like clear speech than they were for the sentences that were preceded by non-matching text. Now, every individual only got each sentence once, but across our group, these materials are identical. So half of our subjects got a particular set of sentences with matching primes. The other half of the subjects got the same sentences but with the non-matching primes. So these two conditions are acoustically absolutely identical across the group. And yet we're seeing this effect of matching text in auditory cortex. Now, as far as we know, auditory cortex doesn't read. And so this suggests that wherever in the brain we're integrating that text into language, those areas are feeding back to auditory cortex and modifying the representation right in primary auditory cortex. Okay, yeah, so that's just to show that this is a significant interaction for those of you who care about such things. Okay, now, so far, you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of interesting maybe, but not really, because never does it happen, well, hardly ever does it happen, that speech is 100% predictable, right? You never know what somebody is going, well, maybe you do sometimes, but if life was always the way that, if all speech was 100% predictable, we'd never have to talk to each other. So speech is often predictable, but not 100% predictable. And so we wanted to just check to see whether a more naturalistic kind of prediction, where you have some idea of what the topic might be, would also enhance perceptual clarity, just as that 100% predictable text prime did. So in this experiment, we had degraded sentences again, and this time they were preceded not by the identical words, but by 3 words that gave you a meaning. They're sort of newspaper headlines that would get you into the right meaning space for the sentence, right? So upset sports player, you see this, and then you hear his face showed that his team had lost the game. And we compared this condition to 2 other conditions where Either the words were unrelated to the meaning of the sentence, or they were just nonsense. And for every sentence, we had people rate the noise. Now, these are noise vocoded sentences, so in a sense, they're all noise, so it's kind of a weird test, but people could do it. And they demonstrated to us that the sentences that had been preceded by these related meaning primes were less noisy perceptually than the sentences that didn't have any priming information, any helpful priming information. This may look like a small effect, but it was significant in our relatively small group of subjects, so it's I think, reasonably robust. So this demonstrates that perceptual clarity is enhanced if you can predict something about what you're about to hear. And I'd suggest that that's the case for much of our lives. And so, we all spend a lot of our time living in an illusory auditory world where the acoustics are poorer than our brain tells us they are, because our brain is predicting and filling in the information, making it seem more clear than it actually is. Okay, here's another example of that. I'm going to play a sentence. So far, I've been talking about information that you get either from the sentence itself or from text cues, which isn't very naturalistic. So, listen to this. Tell me if you can hear, it's me talking here, which might help you. Oops. Try again.
I want to eat the Grandpa Bunny's hearing aids.
Anybody? Good. Yeah. Okay. So imagine you're at a party and your niece and your father are both having a birthday, and it's around Easter time, and there are cakes, and you've made a cake for your niece, and you've made a cake for your father, and the cake for the father, who's the grandpa, has spectacles, because he's a grandpa, and he also has marzipan hearing aids. And so a kid who you know loves marzipan says, I want to eat the Grandpa Bunny's hearing aids. Now, I assert that is a very low context sentence, right? The transitional probabilities between any of those words is very low. And yet, in the context, it makes perfect sense. But you have to be able to appreciate that visual context in order to then hear the sentence. So I'm pretending to be my daughter here, but.
I want to eat the Grandpa Bunny's hearing aids.
Right. And I think that that would be clearer, right? You'd understand it better if you had this context to work from. So these low context sentences happen in life, particularly probably in your domestic life, probably disturbingly often if you have very small children. You find yourself saying things like, don't put ketchup on the baby Jesus, or I want to eat the Grandpa Bunny's hearing aids. So here's another example. Her good slope was done in carrot. Imagine you're somebody's at a catering school and they're making landscapes out of vegetables, and she tried making, a slope landscape out of cucumber and out of broccoli, but her good slope was done in carrot. So we'll combine that with a sentence that's just very straightforwardly sensible, right? Her new skirt was made of denim. That's a sentence where the meaning is nicely held in the sentence itself. You don't have to have extra information to understand the context. And what we see is that the left inferior frontal cortex is more active for these sentences where you're struggling to make sense of it, right? If you don't have the context, it just doesn't make sense, compared to these very tidy sentences where the meaning is quite straightforward. And we've shown that a couple of times. This is one study that's published. This is a study in preparation where we show pretty much exactly the same thing, robust left inferior frontal activity when the brain has to work to understand a sentence, to make sense of it. Okay. So written text cues enhance perceptual clarity. And this results in enhanced auditory cortex activity. That auditory cortex activity looks more like clear speech if you have those written text cues. Clarity is also altered by more naturalistic kinds of prediction, which is suggestive, as I said, that a lot of our auditory experience may result in this illusory perceptual clarity. Okay, and when we're trying to understand the meaning of something, our left inferior frontal cortex has to work harder. Okay, here's another example of knowledge, this time maybe not helping so much. So here are some sentences. They all look like perfectly reasonable, meaningful sentences in English. Those of you who are who speak English as a second or third or fourth or fifth language may have noticed that a number of the words in these sentences, though, have more than one meaning, right? Native English speakers aren't as attuned to this. Somehow our brain just knows which meaning is appropriate, but second language users, your prior probabilities aren't quite so fine-tuned, and so you may have noticed the ambiguity. In a whole series of imaging experiments, my colleagues Jenny Rodd, Matt Davis, and I have looked at how the brain is organized to process sentences that have ambiguous words compared to very well-matched sentences that don't have ambiguous words. And what we find is the following. So auditory cortex cares about sound, not very surprising. The temporal lobes care about speech. The more speech information there is in a sentence, the more active they get. And then when you have these high ambiguity sentences compared to matched low ambiguity sentences, we see these quite robust areas of activity, notably involving the left inferior frontal cortex again. Okay, so again, this points to this area being important for figuring out appropriate meanings in some way, perhaps activating multiple meanings, selecting the appropriate meaning, perhaps reinterpretation. If you heard the match ended in a tie and your initial interpretation of match was the little stick that you light, you would have to go back and find the new meaning to integrate with the rest of the sentence. Interestingly, this area is also active. This is an old study where they looked at phonological jokes versus non-joke sentences. So an example of a phonological joke is, why did the golfer wear 2 sets of trousers? Because he got a hole in one. Ha, ba-dum-bump. Yeah, so you can compare that to a non-joke sentence. Why did the golfer wear 2 sets of trousers? Because it was a very cold day. And what you see when you compare those two types of sentences is activity in the left inferior frontal cortex, again. Again, because you have to be appreciating the wordplay and the multiple meanings, right? That's probably why this activity is here. Okay, so to understand language, we have to be able to resolve ambiguities. These ambiguities are ubiquitous. As I said, 80% of words in English have multiple meanings, so we're always doing this. And it's effortful, right? That left inferior frontal gyrus has to work harder for sentences where ambiguous words are present. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second topic. So that's it for knowledge for now. I'll come back to knowledge in a bit, but now I'm going to move into the question of how well can you process degraded speech if you're not fully attending to it, if you're doing something else at the same time. And this is a nice baseline for looking at listening effort, because we think that listening effort, kind of by definition, requires attention, right? You have to be really focused on something effortfully in order for listening effort to manifest. If you're not paying attention to it, you can't really be listening effortfully. Okay, so we took advantage of the fact that we very well characterized the response of the brain to degraded sentences. So we know that this part of the brain, the temporal lobes, show a kind of response where as intelligibility goes up, activity goes up. We see this nice correlation with intelligibility in these regions. In contrast, in the left inferior frontal cortex, again, we see this more U-shaped function where for both clear speech and for rotated speech, so completely unintelligible, don't even try to understand it, we see rather low activity. But for potentially intelligible degraded speech, where you have to work to understand it, we see this elevated activity. So what we can do is we can have people listening to speech either when they're attending to it or when they're doing something else. And we can see how these signatures change in those two situations. So in the interests of time, I'm just going to move ahead to the results. We used highly intelligible noise vocoded speech here. I will show you the intelligibility profiles. I won't talk to you about the distraction tasks. We used sort of standard cognitive neuroscience, not very interesting distractors here, both auditory and visual, where people either did the auditory distractor or the visual distractor, or they listened to the speech. And all three things were going on every trial. Our participants loved this. Okay, so the speech we used was either relatively high intelligibility noise vocoded speech that was about 90% intelligible, so 90% of the words could be reported correctly in a pilot study, and we used a slightly lower intelligibility noise vocoded condition, as well as our completely unintelligible condition and clear speech. Okay, and this just shows our imaging paradigm. What we do typically in fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, it's really noisy MRI, as any of you who've had an MRI know. And you might wonder, well, how can you use it to study the auditory system with that banging going on? Well, what we do is we take a brain image and we turn the system off and we present our sentences and our other materials. And then we wait for the blood response to reach a maximum. It takes about 4 to 6 seconds for the blood response that fMRI is sensitive to reach a maximum. And then we take another image. So we take advantage of the fact that that blood response is slow, and then people can hear the sentences in quiet, which is nice. So what we found was in these temporal lobe areas, we found when people were not paying attention to the speech, just a straightforward decline in activity as we go from clear speech through to the unintelligible noise vocoded condition. So this is really just mapping onto the stimulus quality. The more degraded the stimulus, the less activity there was. When people were attending, however, we see this bump. Okay, we see that and this is perhaps reflective of the fact that this area is sensitive to the intelligibility of the speech when you are attending. So we see this artificial, if you like, or assisted enhancement of activity in these temporal lobe areas for these potentially intelligible sentences, but only when you're attending to them. So you only get this intelligibility bump if you are listening to that degraded speech. In this frontal area, the left inferior frontal cortex, we didn't really see any activity at all when people weren't attending to the speech. But then when they did attend, we saw that U-shaped function we were expecting, where we see increased activity when the speech is potentially intelligible but degraded, compared to when it's either clear or clearly unintelligible. Okay? So this suggests that attention is gating some kind of repair process that's enhancing intelligibility here. And this is a signature of that either the attentional focus or of those processes that are improving the speech percept. Okay, so how is intelligibility like a duck? We went on to do another imaging study where we used noise vocoded speech that was 100% intelligible. People could report all of the words from the noise vocoded sentences. So clear speech was 100% intelligible. The noise vocoded 12-band was 100% intelligible. These are sentences, mind. And then we also had this lower intelligibility condition. Well, here, clear speech, it's like a duck. The duck looks quite peaceful, right? This looks almost identical. So on the surface, right, the duck looks pretty similar. But under the water, its little leggies are paddling like crazy, right? And you can see that using functional magnetic resonance imaging. So for clear speech, activation didn't really depend on whether people were attending to the clear speech or not. We saw the same pattern of processing in the brain. So if you're doing the dishes or driving and the speech is perfectly clear, your brain will process it the same way. And we don't really see any activity in frontal cortex for clear speech. But for this degraded speech, even if it's 100% intelligible, The activity in the left temporal and frontal regions is critically dependent on attention. Really changes a lot when you're attending to it, and that activity in left inferior frontal cortex is only observed under attention. So this suggests that if speech is even slightly degraded, perhaps you aren't perceiving it fully. You aren't perceiving it quite the same way if you're not fully attending to it. So this has implications, I think, for people with even, a relatively mild or moderate hearing loss that's distorting the speech enough that they have to work a little bit to understand what they're hearing. And also for what Frances was talking about yesterday in terms of effortless hearing, right? If we could make speech really effortlessly perceptible, then perhaps processing in the absence of full attention would be a little more complete. Okay, so degraded and clear speech make different demands on attention. Attention seems to gate processes that are required for recovery and repair. And even mildly degraded speech that's 100% intelligible seems to require these attentional processes to be properly or completely processed. Okay, how are we for time? All right, I've got about 15 minutes left. Is listening effort a special kind of cognitive effort? I kind of don't think so. So here are the various holiday snapshots of left inferior frontal cortex in all of the studies I've been talking about so far, right? So for these low context versus high context sentences, for sentences with ambiguous words, for slightly degraded, mildly degraded materials under attention compared to under distraction. And this area is, as Frances mentioned yesterday, if it's the same area, it's not entirely clear to me because you really need to do a study within individuals. There are a couple of areas in the left inferior frontal region that seem to participate in different attentional networks. And so I'm not sure whether this is the same network over and over again or just very close neighbor. But this area, approximately, comes up in a host of studies across a vast array of different kinds of tasks that cognitive neuroscientists can devise. And John Duncan has called it the multiple demand system. And effectively, it seems to be like the engine light, right? It comes on when you're working, period. And so this is a marker of listening effort, but it's a marker of effort generally. Okay, so I would say that listening effort isn't really special. It's a subjective manifestation of cognitive work being done. But that doesn't mean that listening effort is all one thing, or that the things that give rise to listening effort are unitary. So different challenges to speech comprehension have to be met in different ways. Utterances are different one from another. Each imposes its own unique set of demands, relatively unique. And those demands are met by cognitive processes in our brain. Different processes are appropriate for different demands. So for example, perceptual challenges such as an unfamiliar accent or adverse listening conditions or degradation caused by hearing impairment or the hearing aid processing, all of those are met through the application of cognitive abilities such as the use of context, the ability to read facial gestural information and integrate it with what you're hearing, using word frequency to ascertain what a likely word is that somebody said. So these processes of filling in, right, of repair. We can also talk about linguistic challenges. So I've talked about words with multiple meanings, for example. These low context sentences that come up in everyday life where you have to appreciate either the visual context or context that comes through some other way. So, for example, my husband said to me, apparently apropos of nothing one day, "The cookie planet is my nemesis," which wouldn't have made any sense unless I had been able to remember, as I was, fortunately, able to remember that the previous week he and my son had started playing, I can't remember, Super Mario Galaxy or some Nintendo game where there are different planets like cookie planets and candy planets, and my husband was telling me he couldn't get past the cookie planet stage, I guess. But I had to work that out, and I had to rely on my long-term memory in order to retrieve the appropriate context for that. Okay. Working memory, as Francis said yesterday, is also very important. So if I say to you, many people as they get older become complacent with their lot in life. Ingrid was sad when she realized it had happened to her. In order to understand the antecedents of those various pronouns, you have to have working memory for that whole utterance, right? So that you can correctly map the its and the hers onto what they refer to. Okay. I think I'm going to just skip over this example. I have just a quick example of how the brain responds differently to different challenges, to an acoustic challenge and to the challenge of having ambiguous words and utterances. Well, I'll just go through it very, very quickly. So the ambiguous sentences compared to sentences that are closely matched but don't have ambiguous words in them, right? So we know that this gives rise to this left inferior frontal signature of effort. Okay? And then we present these in a little bit of background noise, or we present them clearly. Interestingly, it turns out that in a little bit of noise, sentences with multiple meanings are less intelligible, probably due to a less defined context, right? If you hear this shell was fired towards the tank in noise, you don't have the clear meaning pointers telling you what the other words must be, right? It becomes a little more open-ended. So it's interesting to see that the same acoustics can give rise to very different intelligibilities depending on the nature of the speech. Okay, and here's the important thing. The fact that this ambiguity manipulation and the noise manipulation give rise to largely disjoint networks of activity in the brain. The brain is responding to these two challenges in different ways. That challenge happens to overlap in the engine light region. Both of them require effort, but the brain is recruiting different systems to respond to these two challenges. Okay, so different challenges to speech comprehension, I assert, are met in different ways, okay? And that means that listening effort isn't unitary. Listening effort depends on the challenges that are imposed by the listening situation and the ability of your brain to meet those challenges. And so that's my last point in the last 5 minutes. I'll just try to make that point more clearly. So what causes listening effort? What produces that subjective feeling of listening effort? It's an interaction, as I said, between the demands of the listening situation and what you as a listener bring to the table. Different utterances make different demands, which are met by your brain in different ways. So I really liked Nina Krause's analogy of the level sliders yesterday, so I'm going to use that too. And let's imagine we have 7 different cognitive abilities. And here are some example abilities that would be important for understanding speech. And a given utterance places particular pattern of demands across these different abilities, say, right? Maybe in this particular situation, there's a masking talker, and so there's quite a high load placed on this, on selective attention or on segregation processes that allow you to perceptually separate different sources, with perhaps some other cognitive resources being less demanded by this situation. Okay. So as I said at the beginning, I trained as a clinical neuropsychologist, right? My job was to carve up cognition, try to figure out how do we explain all of the different ways that human beings think and behave in terms of more modular concepts where we combine those abilities in different ways to produce all of cognition and behavior. It's a task, And we haven't got it right? We don't know how nature's carved up at her joints. We don't know how cognition really ought to be described in a way that truly respects the organization of the brain. But it's certainly true that we are all snowflakes, right? We're all individuals. Everybody has their own individual strengths and weaknesses cognitively. So there are many different ways that you can carve up cognition. Lately, people have been talking more about fluid versus crystallized intelligence. Executive functions are also very du jour. Neuropsychology has traditionally dealt with the material-specific specializations of the two hemispheres, visuospatial specialization in the right hemisphere, verbal specialization in the left hemisphere. This is an example of a very popular intelligence test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and how it's divided up into different cognitive constructs based on performance on various tests, right? And if you look across different people, you can see that the profiles of different people across the different tests are relatively different, right? And so what that means is that everybody has their own endowments cognitively across a whole range of different cognitive abilities, most of which we don't even conceive of yet, right? We've have to work at this. I don't think neuropsychology has it right yet. And if we apply this kind of demand, then what we see, depending on how that demand plays out in these different brains, is this. This person is clearly overwhelmed, right? This person is coping, but it's hard. And this person has no trouble at all. So where this differs from what Francis said yesterday is that I'm taking what Francis said and pushing it beyond working memory. Working memory is important, but so are a host of other cognitive abilities. And working memory may not be quite the right division, actually. Okay, so in conclusion, there may only be one type of listening effort subjectively, but it's due to many different kinds of demands that are placed on many different abilities. There are individual differences in these abilities, and so subjective effort is manifest as the demands exceed ability or come close to exceeding ability. So in order to understand listening effort, right, in order to really make a principled attempt at making it better for people, we need to understand both what the demands of different kinds of speech are and also how people's individual abilities, how their individual cognitive profiles predict when they're likely to experience effort. So with that, I thank you, and I thank my colleagues, both the people in my lab and Jenny Robb, Bob Carline, and Matt Davis, who are longstanding colleagues of mine. Thank you very much.